this portion, Mishpatim, which talks about tort relief, takes place on the day or on the week where I was just granted relief by a DC judge, who was 19 years on the bench, who was no rookie. He's appointed by President Clinton, approved by Congress, so this is about finding relief through the court system. So our portion is all about finding relief through the court system, and so therefore it's appropriate for us to study this portion as well, and especially this week. And so therefore I wanted to spend a few minutes with you and study this portion. So let's just go through the verses. There's so many different laws here, and we'll just try and touch the surface of it, and thereby come to understand basically what these laws are talking about. So we'll start with chapter 21, verse 13. Chapter 21 or verse 12. Chapter 21, verse 12. Am I recording? Yes, I am. So I'm skipping the first three sections, which really are talking about what are we skipping? We're skipping the part about a Hebrew slave and the part about talking about a Hebrew made female slave. We're skipping those two parts because even first of all, the Hebrew made slave is one of the most difficult laws to understand in our modern life. We don't have it anymore. We no longer can you imagine a father selling his daughter to be a slave. We would just, you go to jail today, obviously. And so it's very hard to understand. I just want to say it's obviously different time, very, very different time. But the reason why they did it was to, Tosfot says this, was because there was a concern that what happened, let me just say the law. The law is that a father has the right to sell his minor Jewish daughter, to be a slave to another man. But when she turned 12, he either had to marry her or she would automatically go free. So obviously, this is not something we would do in any shape, form whatsoever today. And if you do it, you should go to jail. So yet the Torah allows it. So we could say, what's the Torah doing here? This seems so backwards, so like the Taliban. It's almost literally like the Taliban. But the way to understand it is that in the ancient world, the fathers lived in fear that they would die before they would be able to marry off their daughters. And then their daughters would not be married off, and they would be like prostitutes or beggars on the side of the road. So this was a way of making sure that their daughter was married off and was provided for in that context. In a time where the community was so life was so tenuous, you wanted to provide security. So it doesn't mean that they engaged in sexual activity before the age of 12. It doesn't mean that they lived like husband and wife. It meant that she was attached in this manner. And all the marriages in those days were arranged. There was no such thing really like going out and dating and marrying in that manner. There is no evidence of that at all in the Bible or in the ancient Talmud. There is no evidence of that. So this whole idea of dating in the singles community is completely foreign. So in that context, arranging a marriage was totally normal. The only thing that was unusual here is that she was sold as a minor. And so there we'd have to say that the only way it makes sense was because they wanted to make sure that she was cared for and that it would be like signing her onto a contract, a deal at a younger age. So this is that's the second law in the Torah, which we're not getting into. And the first law, which we're again not getting into because it's really hard to explain, is the law of the Hebrew slave. And the Hebrew slave is a very difficult concept. There's a concept called the Hebrew slave, and there's also a concept called the Canaanite slave. The Canaanite slave is similar to slavery that existed in America. That's where somebody who was not Jewish was made a slave. Again, this is a really difficult concept to explain. How could the Torah, which is so beautiful, have such a barbaric concept as slavery? The only thing that I would say is that slavery existed in the modern world up until the 19th century. In America, there was slavery. So the idea that the Torah wouldn't have something which was in existence in the whole world up until the modern period is basically placing our values from today back on the Torah's time. And and so the Torah had slavery, but at the same time, the Torah clearly says that a person that a slave that the living in slavery is not the ideal. And even though the Torah seems to say that you're not allowed to free a slave, there are examples in the Talmud of rabbis freeing slaves, even though the Torah says that you're not allowed to free a slave. So the rabbis freed a slave under different circumstances. And this tells us that already in the time of the Talmud, the rabbis were against the concept of slavery. That's the concept called a Canaanite slave. But then there's also at the very beginning of our portion, the concept called a Hebrew slave. A Hebrew slave is very, very different. We use the word eved, but it doesn't really mean slave. It means like a worker. And a person would become a Hebrew slave if he stole something and couldn't pay it back, or if he was poor and he wanted to sell himself for money. Here, the Talmud tells us that such a person the master is required to feed him what he eats, to have him sleep in the same conditions that he sleeps in, to pay for the education of his wife and of his children, and to provide for his wife. And so basically you have to treat this person with dignity, not like a slave, but really like almost an equal. And the Talmud says, that's why it says Hakona Eved, Kona Rabba, that if you acquire a slave, you've really acquired a master. That's the idea of the Talmud. So the way some people explain this idea is that this person who's the Hebrew slave, he did something wrong, very wrong. But rather than warehousing him in a prison, we put him into somebody's home for his spiritual growth. The whole idea of a prison is completely. We're going to see different bodily assaults in this portion, and nowhere is they said, okay, build prisons and warehouse the human beings in prison. The whole idea of a prison is totally foreign to the Bible and to the Talmud. You will not see a prison. You have a holding cell until they went and asked Moshe, what should we do with this person? But there's no long-term stay in a prison. And so this is something that's completely foreign. What would people prefer today? Would they prefer to be like punished in a physical manner by caning, or would they prefer to be spending years and years and years in prisons? So I'm not sure which is more barbaric. I know that the prison system, to my mind, is something that is going to be one day spoken about by historians as just an unbelievable barbarism that's done by this country. That we are warehousing more human beings than any other civilization in the history of humanity. In the history of humanity, think about that. Nobody else has ever created such a system, and it's for profit. Also, the companies are making a lot of profit. Prisons are run by for-profit companies. So, okay. So now that we've said that, now let's go to the portion, and we'll start discussing the laws, law by law. We come to chapter 21, verse 12. It says, "Make ish v'meis mosumas." So this is one who strikes a person is put to death. This is something we're studying in Tractate Sanhedrin now, and we study this every day, that there are 4 types of deaths that the court does. But nevertheless, even though this is book that's on the laws, here too the rabbis litigate, or the rabbis turn this law basically into a dead letter law. Even though if you strike a person, you're put to death, the rabbis put so many limitations on it that it strikes me that the only time it ever happened that they executed people was through something called with a horasha, an emergency state of the situation. And then it says, let's say a person was not intending to kill. He did not have the intent to kill, and it just happened. God brought it about. What does it mean that God brought it about? The rabbis of the Talmud understood that if you had escaped punishment through your own actions, that actually eventually it would catch up with you, and God would arrange it. So then it says, "V'samti lecha makom asher yanu shama," that I will arrange for you there for a place for you to flee to. This is the idea of a city of refuge, that it used to be. You can imagine, you could see from the Torah that people would look and they wouldn't look at intent. And it's still this way in some societies, that if you hurt somebody accidentally, it doesn't matter what your intent is. The society would punish you as though it was a intentional act. The rabbis say right here that it's not, that the Torah says right here that intent is what matters. So if you did not intend to kill him and you killed him accidentally, the Torah created a safe place for you to run to. That was, to my mind, an incredible advance in society. That if the terrible act was done without intent, you had a place where you could be protected. So now the next verse says, this is also a very powerful idea. Now, let's say a person intentionally kills. If you intentionally kill somebody, to kill him with manipulation, to kill him with deceit. And there is the story of Adoniah in the Bible. From the altar you shall take him to put him to death. So, meaning to say, you can't run into, yes, there's a sanctuary city, but I'll tell you what's not a sanctuary. The altar of God is not a sanctuary. That you can't say, oh, don't kill me, I'm worshiping now. So, even from the altar, and Rashi says, if he was a Kohen and he wanted to perform his service, take him and put him to death. And this has to be read on two levels, the literal level, but also a person can't hide behind his sacred duties and say, oh, therefore I should be above punishment. No, that's not the case. That's not the case. Don't say that. It's not the case. Hold on. Okay. So now we're up to the next verse. That one who strikes his father or mother is put to death. Here, the interesting thing is, Rashi says he's put to death through strangulation. Whereas if you curse your parents, we skipped a verse here. It says here, if you curse your parents, you're put to death through stoning. So if you strike your parents, Rahman al-Islam, you're put to death through strangulation. Whereas if you curse your parents, you're put to death through stoning. Now, stoning, the rabbis have four levels of 4 ways that the court can kill you: stoning, burning, decapitation, and strangulation. Stoning, burning, decapitation, strangulation. Everyone is in agreement that stoning is a more severe form of penalty than strangulation. There's 2 different opinions about how you divide up which is the most severe. Is burning more severe than stoning, or stoning more severe? The rabbis say stoning is more severe way to die, and the rabbis also say decapitation is worse than strangulation. So if that's the case, if striking your parent gets strangulation, why does cursing your parent get stoning, a more severe penalty? You're just using words. So Rashi discusses that. Rashi says, he says it's derived through a limud of the text. But the idea is that when you curse your parents, the Talmud says that you have committed a sin against both God and your parents. And so since you've committed a sin against both God and your parents, as opposed to if you just strike them, you have that, the cursing would be to curse them using the name of God. So therefore, once you curse them in that manner, you're cursing them in a manner which is also a sin against God, and so therefore the person will be stoned. So, okay, next verse says, "V'chiyirivun anashim." Okay, so this is basically relevant, exactly what we're talking about. So this is the law of you have to pay damages, and the Talmud says that there are 5 types of damages. There's what's called nezek damages, tsar. What's tsar? Tsar is the pain. How much did the pain hurt you? And how do they determine that? They determine that by how much would you be willing to pay someone to not have to undergo this pain. Then there's the repoi, the medical expenses, the sheves, which is the lost wages, and the boshet is the humiliation. So these are the 5 types of damages if you strike a person. So the Torah says as follows: if 2 men are fighting, and one man strikes the other one, with a stone or a fist, Velo Yamus, and he does not die v'nafal mishkav, and then he does not die, and he basically and he falls into bed. So basically, you strike him down, and he does not die, and he falls, and he lies down. So what are we talking about here? He's not able to work. So that's the penalty of lost wages. And then what does it say? It says, if he gets up and he goes out on his own, then the ones who struck him are absolved. What does that mean? Meaning to say he's absolved from murder if the person dies later on, because they see if he's able to walk on his own or not. If he's able to walk, it means he clearly did not die from the murder. He has to pay his lost wages and his medical expenses. Meaning to say, how do you determine medical expenses? If he has less of an ability to do the same job he could do before, that's how you fulfill his lost wages. And rapo yirapeh, he has to pay the doctor's wages. So the Talmud tells us, what does it mean that if he's that rapo yirapeh? So Rashi says it means that he has to pay the doctor's fee. Let me just read what the Talmud tells us. The Talmud says it does not mean that he himself, the party who injured, must do the healing. It means 2 practical things. If he himself is a doctor, let's say the party, Reuven hit Shimon, and Reuven says, I'm a doctor, I can do the surgery on you. The injured party has the right to say, sorry, I don't want you. I'm gonna get a different doctor. And he says, and secondly, if the person who is injured says, just give me the money and I'll treat myself, the injuring party can say, no, I'm only paying it if you get a doctor, a qualified doctor, because he's saying if you don't recover, then the reputation will be damaged. So therefore, we see from here that that's what the Talmud derives from Rapo Yirapeh. Yes, we'll pause for a second. Good, Bruce or April, of course. We were talking at the beginning about the Hebrew slave, but now we're going to talk about the Canaanite slave a little bit. Now, I said at the beginning, the Canaanite slave is like slavery in America. I mean to say he's your slave. But there's a fundamental difference. Even when the Torah has slavery, there's a huge difference. And we'll see it in this verse. What's this law? This is the law of Yom or Yomayim, a day or 2. What's the law? The law says as follows: a man will strike his slave or his female slave with a stick, and he will die underneath his hand. He shall surely be avenged. What does that mean? Will you come? Then he will not be avenged. If he's alive for 1 or 2 days, he will not be avenged. Because he is his money. So what this tells us is, let's say a person strikes his own slave and the man dies within that 24-hour period, then the master is responsible, and the master will be judged as though he killed any other human being, and he'll be put to death for that. Meaning to say, if the master kills the slave, the master is put to death. But if it's after the 24-hour period, then we say the master was justified. In those days, they believed it was justified to hit someone. We don't believe that anymore, obviously. And then the master will not be punished. But we see from here that this is laying the groundwork for recognizing that this is another human being in front of you. And once you recognize that this is another human being, it's just one less step to recognizing that the whole law is completely immoral and needs to be done with. And obviously, obviously should not be followed today with in any shape or form whatsoever. But that's the idea here of 24 hours. Now, there's another way in which a slave is demonstrated that he's a human being, and that is if you knock out the slave's eye or tooth or 22 other limbs, his digits on his hands and his legs and his nose, then the slave automatically goes free. So this shows us that if the master beats the slave in an excessive manner, the slave will automatically go free because that he's abused his slave's rights. So the slave has fundamental rights. The slave in the Torah has rights. He has rights. He could pursue his rights. This tells us that this is not the same type of this is laying the groundwork to get rid of slavery entirely. Now we're up to the next verse, and this is the idea of basically someone will view this for the Torah's approach to abortion. In the next verse, it says, if two men are fighting, v'nagfu isha hara, and when they were fighting, they one of them strikes the pregnant woman, v'yatsuyu adeha, and her offspring is she miscarries basically, v'lo ason, but he does not die or she does not die. I mean, in this case, Rashi tells us the woman does not die, her fetus dies, but not the woman. Anoshi anesh, he'll be punished. Kasher yashita lav ba'al isha, when the husband and the woman shall impose upon him, and he shall give it through judges' orders. So basically, so what's going on here? Rashi tells, let me just pause for a second. I see April and Bruce, and then we'll talk about this case, which is the case of abortion. So the basic point is, it says, when the two men are fighting, they're fighting with one another, Rashi says, and he intends to strike his friend, but instead he strikes the woman. And then they jostle, meaning he pushes her down. And the woman is not killed, but he miscarried the woman. That he caused the woman to be miscarried. He has to pay. He has to pay the value of the offspring, of the aborted offspring, to the husband of the woman who he struck. And how do they determine the value of the fetus? They determine the value of the fetus by saying, if this woman had been in the marketplace, how much would she have sold for, and with a baby and without the baby? So, I mean, obviously that seems so vulgar, but if insurance company law has to determine a person's life in a accident, they use similarly cold calculations. But we see from here that if a person kills the baby, he is not judged with the death penalty. He's judged with a monetary penalty. This seems to indicate that the punishment for abortion is monetary, that it's a tort as opposed to a capital offense. But there are other sources that indicate that the penalty for abortion is death. So for this reason, just to summarize this for everybody, there's three different major approaches in Jewish law to abortion. One is that it's simply a tort, and it's basically like an assault. And the other is that if under certain circumstances, it could be a murder. But that, the Talmud says, is if an idolater does it. But for a Jew, it's considered an assault. So is abortion permitted by Jewish law? Here we want to say that there are three approaches. There are some who say it's absolutely never permitted. It's like a murder, unless the baby is threatening to kill the life of the mother. Otherwise, it's a murder. There are others who take the opposite approach and say it's basically almost always permitted. It's certainly in the early stages, and it's almost like water in the early stages. And then there's a third approach, which says that under certain extreme circumstances, extenuating circumstances, where the mother's mental health will be compromised, that'll be permitted. So it's there isn't unanimity on this, and modern authorities have given very different rulings on this within the Orthodox community. Rav Moshe Feinstein was very strict about it, but the Tzitz Eliezer, who was the chief postic of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem, a major postic in Israel, he was very lenient in this area. So there's a lot of different approaches. I heard myself once a share from Rav Schechter. You never want to quote a different rabbi because you always quote it wrong. So don't act on this. But I heard a case from Rav Schechter where he said that the woman got pregnant. They were married. They were engaged to be married, and she got pregnant. And the question was brought to him that if the boy's father would find out about it, then he would cancel the wedding. And they want to know if that was sufficient for her to be able to get an abortion under those circumstances. And he said it was okay. He said it was okay under those circumstances. So you see that there's a lot of leeway on this, depending upon who the postic is. Okay, so now we go to and I will skip the I for the I, and we'll go now to the case of the ox that gores, the goring ox, which is chapter 21, verse 28. Chapter 21, verse 28, it says, "V'chiyigach shor ish oles isha v'meis." If a man will gore under those circumstances, he said, I think his quotation was, well, you see, we're anyway, this is what he said, if I remember correctly, and I'm remembering this from like 10 years ago. He said, well, anyway, we're not dealing with the most pious people in the world because they were committing, they were engaged in sexual activity before their marriage. So he said, under those circumstances, he said it was okay because these weren't people who were never careful not to sin. So therefore, he thought that this wasn't the area to be strict upon them with, and he allowed it. So now we're up to the idea of a goring ox. So when it comes to a goring ox, the Talmud tells us, so there's a distinction between two types of oxen. There's what's called a goring ox, that's called a muad. That's an ox that's gored 3 times. That ox is called a shor muad. And then there's a shor tam. A tam is an ox that has never gored before. Tam can mean simple. So the goring ox pays full damages, and the ox that's never gored before, the owner of the ox pays half damages. So the reason is that the ox that's gored, there was the assumption that it's the muad ox, that the assumption is that the owner of the ox should have been more careful, should have understood that was what was going to happen, and so therefore he's responsible to pay full damages. And also, if an ox gores and kills somebody, you know what you do with the ox itself? The ox itself is stoned to death, and the ox has to be judged by a court of 23. The Talmud says you have to take 23 judges to look at the ox and judge it before deciding its fate. So that's the story of the ox. I mean, there's an entire tractate about this. It started in Baba Kama, the beginning of it, and we spend months on it, but that's the basic introduction to that law. And then we have the law of what's called a bore. This is what's called a pit in the public domain. A pit in the public domain, if it's 10 tefachim deep, that's the Talmud says it's capable of killing someone. I want to say about the ox that's goring the following story that I read there's a beautiful book called In My Father's Court by Joshua Singer. Anybody here ever read it? Yeah, so Joshua Singer was the brother of Isaac Bashevis Singer. And In My Father's Court was a beautiful book. It's about I'm not going to say I remember the whole book perfectly, but it was about how he was describing how the world was falling apart with World War I. And he was describing his father's court. His father was a Hasidic master. Now, he said there in the thing, the whole world is falling apart. They're waging wars, and they're still discussing the ox that gores. I mean, like, why is this even relevant to us? Is what he was saying. Like he was making fun of the Talmudic scholars that they're sitting there studying this completely esoteric topic of the ox that gores while the world is falling apart. And I remember reading it even as a little kid. I mean, I only read it once. I remember reading it even before I loved Talmud the way I love it today. And I remember thinking to myself that this incredibly talented author, Joshua Singer, I loved his writing style, I loved the book, but he completely doesn't get it. He completely doesn't get that when the world is falling apart, all the more so do we need to read about the ox that gores and try to understand it. That these are laws that give order to our world that has no order. And the rabbis themselves, when they described all these laws, they weren't necessarily able to apply them. In most cases, in 99% of the cases in the Talmud, the rabbis didn't have the ability, the authority, maybe not 99%, but an overwhelming percentage of the cases in the Talmud, rabbis didn't have the ability to apply it, but it was their imagination of a world the way it was supposed to be lived. And how much more so when the world is falling apart do we need to imagine a world the way it's supposed to be lived? And so I think that the more the world falls apart, and it feels like every day the world is falling apart to an even greater degree than yesterday, the more so we need to study and to imagine a way the world could ideally be lived. That's the power. That's the power of Torah study. Torah study gives everybody the opportunity to dream about a better world. Anyway, you know what? That's a beautiful place in my mind to stop. But I'll take some questions. Also, I want to remind
Very
everybody
nice.